Let me make the best possible case I can for the existence of institutional racism in the way that you framed it. So you say that the reason that this is happening is that people from ethnic minority backgrounds live in deprived areas, much more than white people. And as a result, there's more crime. As a result, there's more policing. As a result, there's more interaction, etc. Right? But isn't that what people mean when they say institutional racism, that essentially minority populations are growing up in areas where they have bad schools, bad, social organization, bad access to activities for children, that they can't go out and play or whatever. And as a result of that, there's more crime. And therefore, it's the poverty that they end up growing up in that's causing all this other stuff later in life.
I think that's why we have to be clear what we mean by institutional racism, because, I would suspect maybe many people would describe what you're describing, that phenomenon, as institutional racism. But we have to remember the racism part of that argument. That what you're describing, yes, that is institutional. It's institutional something. But we have to remember that racism is a very serious thing, It has to be happening because of somebody's race, if you're going to use that racism word. And what we see in the data is that race is not a good explanatory factor for why things happen the way they do.
What do you mean? But when you say the evidence isn't showing that?
For example, if you look at Indians versus Pakistani and Bangladeshi, if you look at Black African versus Black Caribbean, race is not a good determiner for what outcomes your life will have. That's what the data shows. It's all these other factors. And so, outcomes are so fragmented and so all over the place. Some groups are, subgroups are doing so well. Some are doing really poorly, even if they're the same race. That's why this racism argument begins to kind of break down quite quickly. Do pockets of, racism exist in particular neighborhoods and things like that? I'm sure they do. But I think once we start kind of unpicking that, so, for example, you said about living in deprivation, poor access to particular institutions and services. Okay, well, let's tackle that. Let's find out why it is that they have that poor access. Let's, come up with policies to help them out of poverty, that's where the conversation should be. And once you say, well, it's institutional racism, so the system itself, is out to get ethnic minorities or Black people, then, you can't go much further than that. The conversation should be, okay, well, if they're disproportionately more likely to live in poor neighborhoods, what can we do about that? How can we empower them to make sure their prospects are better? And that's why it is important that things, for example, take employment and wage gaps. The wage gaps at its lowest for a decade at 2.3% between ethnic minorities and the white British population. For under 30s, there's no statistically significant wage gap, which I'm sure, everybody would welcome. Again, ethnic minorities, we commissioned research, as I said earlier, and into education and social mobility and ethnicity and things like that. And ethnic minority kids, control for every factor, and they're still more likely to outperform their white British counterparts. These are things we should be celebrating. And actually, these are the things that are going to then impact wealth in the future of ethnic minorities. So let's kind of, carry those things on. And I think that's the way the conversation should go. What can we identify that can kind of have a tangible impact on people's lives? Because ultimately, it is, as much as we like to talk about kind of philosophical, sociological concepts when we're talking about race, like systemic racism, white privilege, all those things, everybody's living their life in a very tangible way. And the poorest people and the most deprived people care about putting food on the table. They care about their job and, they care about their health and things like that. So we should be having conversations in that space about actual tangible issues, really, not like, white privilege, systemic racism, etc.